Okay, well, I think it is recording, so we'll get started. So welcome to the Lunch and Learn UK Bat Species Halloween edition. I think that was the remit. And the goal of the session is basically to give you an overview of all the bats in the UK, sort of what their ecology and biology is, where to find them, also what to do if you find them on site, and then a little bit of an insight into what our ecologists at ground control actually do, what sort of surveys they undertake, and the sort of the purpose of those, and a little bit of the tech that we use at ground control as well. Um, so my name's Oliver Silver. I'm the head of ecology at ground control, and I've probably done at least several hundred, if not 1,000, bat surveys in the various forms over the last 8 years that I've been within ecological consultancy in the UK. That amounts to things like dusk dawn surveys, also preliminary roost assessments of things like trees and buildings, all designed to try and identify, is there a bat roost here or not? And then once we know that, we can also dig in a little deeper and try and figure out what species of bat we're talking about. I apologize for the horrendous graphics in this presentation, as you can tell by the first slide. But I thought that this image of a horseshoe bat was probably the closest thing to Halloween that I could find. You can see it's by far the ugliest of all the 18 species of bats that we have in the UK. Some people think that they're cute. I tend to disagree, especially with this one here. So this is a lesser horseshoe, and it gets its name from this nose leaf, which kind of looks like a horseshoe. And the idea here is that when the bat echolocates, the ultrasonic waves that come back off the prey item hit the bat's face, and it's able to detect the position of the prey item, how fast it's traveling, where it is, the size of it, all sorts of things. That's what that nose leaf helps with. So yeah, and you're about to meet all 18 of these really glorious looking animals. So let's see if we can get the next slide. Cool. So I won't run through all these in detail, but I'll sort of just pick out the ones that are of interest to ecologists or what have you. So we've got the Alcatho bat, Barbastelle, Bechstein, Brandets. These are all resident bat species. And actually on the BCT website, which is the Bat Conservation Trust website, they describe the Barbastelle as a rare bat with a pug-like face, which I thought was pretty amazing. Yeah, it's one of the more interesting looking bats, quite distinguishable by how like dark the coloration is as well. And the interesting thing about this bat is where it decides to roost. So we don't use the term nesting in bat biology or ecology. We use the term roost. And so this bat is found within cracks and crevices, pretty much exclusively within trees. So where you see things like a lightning strike that's hit a tree trunk and created a vertical split down that tree trunk, that's where you're going to find this sort of Barbastelle bat. So quite a rare species and indication of sort of like healthy woodland environments as well. We move on to the next slide. We've got all these lovely looking critters here. Again, this is another example of a horseshoe bat. So that first example we saw was a lesser horseshoe, but this is a greater horseshoe bat, so another variation, equally disgusting. But these ones over here on the left-hand side are ones that ecologists encounter all the time. And actually, the clues in the name for common pipistrelle if you're walking through your local park at about dusk time, walking home from work, and you see a bat flying past you or beneath the sort of like tree canopy, more than likely it's going to be a common pipistrelle bat, or it might be a soprano pipistrelle bat. They look quite similar. They're the most abundant bat species we have in the UK. Those two species combined, I would say. And they're tiny. They're absolutely tiny. So I sort of describe the size of a common pipistrelle, the body at least, to be the size of a chicken nugget. It's that small. If you actually hold them in your hand when we're doing handling exercises and trying to identify them, they kind of buzz. It's almost like holding like a bee buzzing in your hand. That's what it feels to feel the echolocation and sort of distress signals that these sort of bats produce. And it weighs about the same as a 20p coin. So you get a scale of sort of how small these bats are, and that's true across all the 18 species we have in the UK, all very, very small bats. Then we've got the brown long-eared, which, you know, again, it's quite obvious how this bat gets its name. This bat is often associated with sort of residential and commercial redevelopments and planning applications, because they're often found in the loft spaces of buildings. So if you want to replace your roof, if you want to demolish a building, you're probably going to come across a brown long-eared bat if you have a bat roost in your building. Now, these large ears aren't just for show. They are said to be able to hear a ladybird walking across a leaf. So that's how sensitive those ginormous ears are. And it's quite funny because when my ecologists and I do internal inspections of buildings, it's when we come across these brown long-eared bats, it's really, really obvious. We don't need to take, for example, eDNA samples, or we don't necessarily need to hear the echolocation calls because they're so distinctive. Okay. Grey long-eared, another variation of these long-eared species, Leisler, lesser horseshoe, Nethusius, all quite interesting names. Again, just more sort of variations. And these bats just occupy different niches. Some are sort of specialists in woodland environments, others in sort of more wetland, sort of river, stream sort of environments. But yeah, they all occupy different niches. Okay, we've got Natterers, Noctule, Serotine, Soprano. Again, Soprano pipistrelles, much like common pipistrelles, really, really abundant. Our ground control ecologist just this year identified a roost where there were over 300 of these Soprano pipistrelles within one loft space, 300 bats. Now, that is considered by Natural England and the like as a sort of nationally significant roost. So it was a really, really important find. And so we're really happy to undertake those surveys. The other interesting sort of species is the noctule, typically associated with, you can see this woodpecker hole behind it. So instead of like splits in tree in tree trunks, they prefer sort of like more sort of, I guess, concrete sort of like holes and voids and things like that. And this one's quite interesting. If you're doing a bat survey, they have a different behavior to other bats, whereby their flight lines are very straight and really, really high above your head. So unlike things like common pipistrelles, which will just be foraging literally within a couple of meters of you, so that's kind of interesting as well. And just lastly, we've got the whiskered bat, which is the final sort of, you know, resident bat species. It's got this like real sort of shaggy fur on it, which is quite distinctive. And then finally, the great mouse-eared bat, which is considered like a non-native. It's a visiting species, and it was actually thought to be extinct and declared extinct in 1990, but subsequently it's been found in Surrey, and even more recently than 2002, I think somewhere circa 2015, ecologists found it hibernating in a cave in Surrey, which is cool. Any questions on those bat species before we march on? No? All
Oliver,
equally ugly,
so,
or is there one that you prefer?
sorry, Oliver, it's Nikki. I put a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. I just said we have a bat that appears in our garden and swoops
Mhm.
in circles most evenings, spot on
Mhm.
dusk.
Mhm.
Where would it be living?
Most probably it's living within like a roof void or under a tile associated with a building. So there's tons of cracks and crevices and things that bats can roost within. And it's actually surprising how small those cracks and crevices can be. So it doesn't need to be this giant loft space. It can be as small as a lifted tile. And unlike the sort of mental imagery that you might get of a bat hanging upside down and hanging, bats in the UK more commonly sort of like crevice dwell. So they're happy just to squeeze themselves under something, and that's enough for them to constitute a roost. So I would say it will be under a lifted roof tile just on one of the neighboring properties, or even potentially your property. And then that behavior where it's swooping around in circles, it's foraging, it's looking for insects, and it's catching and eating those.
Cool.
Lovely. Okay, yeah, a little bit of quick sort of, anatomy and biology. So you can see all these sort of descriptors are quite similar to like human anatomy, right? So you got thumbs, forearms, you got fingers, knees, feet, all stuff obviously that you quite typically observe on a mammal, because bats are mammals. They give birth to live young, and actually these thumbs and forearms are exactly what you're probably thinking. They're evolution's way of creating wings from a hand, essentially. If your fingers extended out this long and then became webbed in between, you'd have something similar to a bat wing. And they're actually quite robust. Like when we try and identify bats in the hand, you can pull the wing out, and they're quite sturdy. They're quite robust. Yeah, they're quite sturdy animals. And the different morphology between the different fingers and the shapes and lengths of those fingers are characteristics which ecologists use literally with calipers to understand which bat species they're dealing with if they can't identify it easily. So that's just another point. And then this is a graphic of how sonar works. I'm sure you guys are au fait with sonar, but basically the bat's producing an ultrasonic sound wave. It's hitting a prey item. That sound wave is bouncing back, and then the bat interprets that to understand again how far the prey item is, where it is, how big it is, etc. Now, there is a misconception that bats have really bad eyesight, but that's actually not true. Bats have really good eyesight, especially the ones in the UK, but they just combine that really good eyesight with sonar, basically, to capture food items. Here's the sort of typical life cycle of a bat, which is this comes from the Bat Conservation Trust guidelines. It's the Bible for all ecologists, because we need to know when bats are behaving in different ways. The hibernation period here, obviously over winter, bats are really, really sensitive, and we're trying to advise our clients and developers to avoid any works, any impacts to bats, because if you start, for example, doing a re-roofing exercise, for example, in the middle of Jan, all the bats are going to leave your roost. They're going to be exposed to really cold weather and a lack of prey items, which ultimately will mean they won't survive. So that's why it's important to understand these different periods. And essentially, after hibernation, bats are getting ready to raise their young. Maternity roosts are created. Pups are being born. That's the name for juvenile bat offspring, pups. And then the pups are leaving in sort of September time, and then bats are sort of eating as much as they can before going back into hibernation. Now, if you work in a part of ground control that is in sort of construction or development, you are felling trees or you are demolishing buildings or you have any association with that, it's important for you to know approximately what this life cycle is, because ecologists can only undertake bat surveys between May and September. So this is a pretty small window. So if you come to us in October and say, hey, ecology team, I think there might be bats in the building that we want to demolish. Please, can you go out and do some surveys? We're going to say, you're going to have to wait all the way at least 6 months, maybe 7 months until the 1st of May before we can go back out and do those surveys. So it is actually really important for everyone who's in that sort of industry to understand those typical survey windows for bats. Okay, now we know what bats we've got. We know what their general life cycle is, kind of how they're built. We now want to know where they're roosting. So trees and buildings is quite simply the two places where you'll find bats most commonly. This is an example of a woodpecker hole that has been converted basically into a bat roost. So bats do not create their own roosts. They have no mechanism to actually make their own roosts like a bird does. So they have to occupy basically prefabricated roosts. This is a woodpecker hole which bats have decided to occupy, and you can see this dark staining outside of the woodpecker hole, which indicates it is an active bat roost, basically. You get an example here of like really lifted tree bark where it's kind of falling off the tree. Again, because they're crevice dwelling, that's more than enough for a bat to crawl underneath that bark and be protected from the elements, such as to use it as a roost. And then finally, we've got an example of sort of like an artificially created roost where, you know, someone's basically just stuck a chainsaw into that tree trunk and created an artificial roost that bats could occupy. The second category is buildings, obviously. So if we look in this top left-hand corner here, you can see that there's a ventilation slit that basically sits between the external face of the building and the internal loft space. Bats love this because it creates a nice constant sort of temperature inside the building. They're protected from predators, and they've got a great little base jumping point, essentially, for them to crawl out, base jump off the ventilation slit, and then take flight. So, and you can see here, it looks to be probably a common pipistrelle bat there leaving the bat roost. That's also what we're looking for when we do surveys, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. This image here is what it might look like inside this building. So you can see the wooden beams, you can see the roofing material here, and then probably 50 to 100 brown long-eared bats all tucked up together, squeezing into the crevice of that roof space. And this is something that we'll be looking for, obviously, when we undertake these surveys. Finally, we've got bat boxes. So here's a few crude examples of bat boxes on buildings, on trees, and we recommend these for enhancement measures, but also compensation. So if a developer destroys a building, we might recommend bat boxes go up to compensate for that loss, so the bats have somewhere that they can live. These usually cost between anywhere from 30 quid to 200 quid, depending on how much you want to spend. Go. Okay, in terms of legislation, all you need to know is bats are really, really heavily protected. England, Wales, and in Scotland, and essentially the same legislation says the same thing. It says basically, thou shalt not kill or injure any bat. Thou shalt not destroy any breeding or resting place, which is a roost, as we've discussed. I don't think anyone here is interested in selling or transporting dead bats, but that is also covered just in case you were thinking of doing that. And the ramifications for breaking the law here are actually quite significant. So 6 months in prison or an unlimited fine. I've never heard of anyone actually receiving a prison sentence for destroying a bat roost or killing a bat, but some quite serious fines have been issued in the sort of, tens of thousands of pounds. But what's even worse than that is the reputation that you receive as a company for recklessly destroying a bat roost or killing or injuring a bat, because it's just so preventable with the right surveys. And there is a pathway out. If you need to destroy a bat roost, you can apply for a license to do that legally. And that's also something that our ecologists offer as well. Okay, so why should we care about bats? Pretty simple reasons, really. They're pollinators, they're something's food source, and they also eat a lot of insects. So common pipistrelle can eat over, I think it's 3,000 insects in a night. Many of those are probably mosquitoes. So if you don't love mosquitoes, you should love bats by association. And they're also an indication of biodiversity as well, the health of an ecosystem. If the bats leave, that's probably an indication that something isn't right with the habitat on a sort of local scale. And what do you do if you find bats on site? Well, as per the toolbox talk that you'll find on our on the IMS on SharePoint, it says basically just stop works immediately, give us a call, and let your line manager or your project manager know, and we can handle it from there. Don't try and handle the bats or continue the works. That would probably be the worst thing to do. So yeah, you can always refer to that toolbox talk if you need a quick guide on the do's and don'ts of bats in the UK. Okay, and now these last few slides, I just wanted to give you a sense of what it's like to actually be an ecologist and what it looks like to undertake these surveys on the ground. So imagine that this is your house and you've said to us, hey, we'd like to replace the roof. An ecologist will come out and they'll do an inspection. They'll walk around the building. They'll look for features, like might be a lifted roof tile. It could be some damaged brickwork here. And then we'll make an assessment. We'll say, okay, we think this building is either low, medium, or high potential for bats. Once we've done that, we'll come back, and as you can see here, the surveyor is sitting at a fixed point, and they are conducting a dusk emergence dawn reentry survey, which involves basically an ecologist sitting there for about 2 hours looking for bats emerging from this building. So they're hoping to see, let's say there's a lifted roof tile here, they're hoping to see a bat emerge, swoop down and leave the roost. That would be a massive win for ecologists. We would then be able to confirm the bat roost, and then we would put measures in place to protect it, either through licensing or what have you. You can see the ecologist has got a bat detector here, which is actually a smartphone connected to a bat, essentially a ultrasonic detector. So it pairs up with the phone and allows us to actually see the calls in real time. So that's what our ecologists are doing between sort of May and September, trying to detect bat roosts, and we've been quite successful this year. This is a new piece of kit that we're using, which is essentially an infrared camera, which is paired up with an infrared torch. And then it's also got a smartphone with a ultrasonic detector attached to it. So quite an expensive setup, but this allows us to basically see in the dark. And the advantage is, as well, is if we're unsure whether we think we saw a bat emerge, we can obviously just replay the footage as many times as we like, interrogate it as much as we like, and ascertain whether we think we've found a bat roost or not. You can see on this right-hand side, this is kind of an indication of what the camera is seeing. And in this case, it was a missing ridge tile. That was enough of a point of interest for us to constitute a survey. This is kind of what the camera sees. And I just wanted to include this photo just because it shows you the sort of how wide the camera can see even at night. It's basically illuminating a giant sort of 30-meter tall tree. Now this is a cell phone image of this screen essentially. So, but trust me when I say you can zoom in with these cameras and you would literally be able to see an insect on a leaf. It's that detailed. And it kind of gives you an indication of what the infrared torch is doing. You can see the beam of it there. And this is an image of the same tree, but zoomed right in. So this tree is 30, maybe even 40 meters away. And we can see with like incredible sort of clarity the feature that we want to survey and whether bats are about to emerge from that feature or not. So we're hoping to get even more of these cameras within the ecology team and build on the surveys we had this year. And finally, these are the contacts. These are the people, the guys and girls that you want to reach out to if you have any questions about bats. You think you might have bats in your buildings or trees on your development site. Myself, Alison, Paul, Haley, these are people that you can speak to on Teams or what have you, and we can help you with all things bat related. Thanks for your time, guys. Apologies I ran over slightly, but any questions on that? I'll check the chat because I did see something. So there's a question here. I came across roosting bats last week whilst undertaking dormouse nest tube checks. They can be located in the most unlikely places. Yeah, that's definitely unusual. I've never heard of that. But yeah, it is incredible, what bats will use for a roost, and also just the size of the roosting feature itself can be incredibly small. As I said, even a slightly raised roof tile is enough for a bat to use that as a roost, which is really strictly protected. Cool. If there's no more questions, happy to. Oh, there's one more. What would you do, from Amanda? What would you do if you found a bat on the grass / patio? It's an interesting question. Actually, I'll give you a more sort of haunting picture, which is that what happens if a bat flies into your place of residence, right? Because bats are protected from disturbance under national legislation. It actually says within the national legislation that it is not an offense to flush a bat, disturb a bat out of your place of residence. So if one does fly into your lounge, into your room, whatever, you can quite legally, without calling anyone, telling anyone, remove that bat from your house, and no offense has been committed. If you find one on the grass or your patio, it's probably not doing too well. It's probably sick. You can take that to a local bat carer. So if you type in like bat care, there'll be a local bat group that will happily take that off your hands. I would highly recommend, if you're happy to handle it, wearing a glove, putting it into a container that's got some, bit of padding in there, Tupperware container, and taking it to a bat carer. But at the same time, if you're not comfortable with that, you could just leave it and let it sort of leave on its own accord. But I would suspect that it's probably sick. Just to say as well, I would advise that you sort of steer towards not handling bats if you can possibly avoid it. I think that when a bat is seriously injured or sick is a gray area. But there are a small percentage of bats in the UK that carry rabies. So it is a very, very tiny percentage. It's not something that anyone needs to be worried about, but that's the reason why ecologists that are tasked with handling bats have a set of rabies injections prior to doing any bat handling on that very, very unlikely scenario that they do. The bat they're handling does carry rabies and they are sort of bitten or scratched. Guys, that was my pleasure to present that. Any other questions you think of between now and the end of the day, give me a shout or give my ecologists a shout and we'll be happy to help you out. Apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day and hopefully you've got a new appreciation for the ugliest animals in the UK.